Alrighty. And we started. Hello. Are we good to go? Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. Today is actually our second Lunch and Learn of the whole year, so we're really excited to be here today. My name is Sonia Lopez. I am the Community and Parent Engagement Coordinator for Community Voices here at Crystal Stairs. And today we're going to break down the California state budget with you and what it means for childcare and for families everywhere in LA County. We're very lucky to have two guests today from the California Budget and Policy Center. They're going to walk us through all of it. And I will now be going to the next slide. That will. We're going into a welcome, housekeeping. We will be going into the Community Voices program overview for those who don't know what Community Voices is all about. And then we will go into the introduction and presentation. And if you need translation help, here are some things that can help you. Please click the interpretation sign, that is the little globe. Once you click it there, you should be in English or Spanish. Alrighty, I'll leave it there up for a moment in case you need it. Alrighty. And now agreements, because this is a safe space and a learning space. If you have questions, please use the chat. We may take a few minutes to respond, but we will review before the webinar ends. And if you get disconnected, don't worry, log back in. We will accept you at any time. And we are recording the session. So if you need to see this again or send it to someone you want to inform, we will have this recording available for you through email a few days after this session. And no breaks are scheduled, so please enjoy your lunch. Feel free to eat, to drink, and please keep yourself on mute and raise your hand if you have a question or put it in the chat. That way we can make sure everybody gets heard or a chance to speak. And we all have an opinion, so this is a neutral zone. So please keep the focus on the California state budget and the process. Thank you. And a little bit of the overview of Community Voices. So, Community Voices is a county-wide advocacy program here in LA. So, not just here in South LA or Ledbetter Heights, all over LA. So at the core, we're all about building parent and provider leadership. We're about helping families become stronger advocates through sessions that we do, such as these. And we also do civic engagement, advocacy events, and we get folks right in front of legislators to make sure that we all have a voice and a seat at the table to make sure child care needs are heard. And a little bit of our history. So we go way back. We started all the way in 2005. It came out of a simple need. We felt that parents and providers needed to come together to advocate side by side to help reach access to quality and affordable child care development programs. And this was to unite families and providers and to help close the divide between legislators and ourselves. And so what we do, so we have our three tenets. We have educate, empower, and advocate. So what we do, an example of educate is today, our workshop. So we help people make sure they have the most accurate and trustworthy information. And sometimes that could be hard to find. So we built this kind of civic understanding that makes participation possible, such as today as breaking down the state budget webinar. Empower. We simply remind people of the power they have already inside themselves. We do these things as story workshops. We are talking one-on-one interviews, and we really support parents in leading their own leadership skills through if they need help or access to resource, etc. So advocate, and we carry those voices forward, amplifying them to policymakers. We recently took more than 80 parents and providers, along with different organizations, to Sacramento to speak directly to policymakers. So that is something that we feel very strongly about in the LA County. And so our why, this is the heart of it all. We speak because children can't vote. So our youngest don't have a seat at the table. So it's our job to carry that voice for them. So thank you for being here. And with that being said, I will pass the mic to our public policy manager, Justin Blakely.
Thank you so much, Sonia. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're enjoying your lunch. Thank you, for all joining. I'm looking at our participant list. We have 86 people on right now, and so really excited that you all took some time to come and hear about the state budget. The budget is such a critical thing that we are always tracking and always want to make sure our community voices members and maybe if you haven't even signed up to be a member, but you heard about this webinar, we always think it's just very important to be able to make sure that we're all up to date on what's going on. You may have heard a statement before, but it always is resonates with me, which is that, our budgets reflect our values. And our state has finalized its budget. And we're so excited to have Laura Pryor and Eric Salcedo of the California Budget and Policy Center to break it down as they do for us each and every year. What's exciting about this year is that we're at June 30th, meaning the final budget is signed, and so we'll get some really great, I would say, the first inside scoop of things, and it's really important. Like Sonia said, is that we are listening to trusted messengers and the California Budget and Policy Center does an excellent job of breaking this down and provide great resources as they present these really important matters. And so, without any further ado, I want to pass it to Laura and Eric to lead us on the California state budget, breaking it down and letting us know what it means for us and our community. So, without any further ado, Laura and Eric, take the floor.
Yeah, thank you so much, Justin and Sonia, for inviting us today. Really excited to share what we know at this point about the state budget. As you mentioned, it was recently signed or agreed to last Friday, and the details have been emerging over the last few days, including the weekend. Uh, so on the next slide, here's just a quick overview of what we're going to be covering today. I'm going to start with a few key facts about the state budget, which are part of our, and let me set my timer here because I tend to go over, part of a much longer training on the state budget process that takes about an hour. I'm going to try to cover as much as I can in 7 minutes. And then I'm going to just then I'm going to go into providing some really high level takeaways from the budget, focusing primarily on revenues, what things kind of look like there. And then I'm going to hand it off to Laura, who's going to dive into the details as it relates to childcare. And then we'll end with reviewing a little bit of what's next over the next few weeks. So next slide. So let's start here with those key facts about the state budget. The state so starting with revenues, the revenues that support public services come primarily from three sources. And then on the next slide, we can see this nice donut chart that shows you those three areas. So this chart shows you the projected revenues for the fiscal year 25-26. So the one that is ending actually today. So the key takeaway here is that the almost three-quarters of revenue come from three major sources, or the big three. We have there the personal income tax, which is that darker orange. Then we have the sales and use tax. You can see that right next to it and to the left of it. And then we have the corporation tax, which is a tax on business income. So keep these in mind because I'm going to come back when I talk about the tax-related proposals that are included in the revenue in the budget. So just keep this donut chart in mind. Um, so again, revenues, three major sources. So now that we looked at that, let's see how they fit in the overall state budget. So the state budget is made up with three types of funds, along with a lot of federal dollars. So on the next slide, you can see here another chart. So this one shows you that state funds make up about 2/3 of the state budget, while federal funds make up the other third. You can see that in the green, and then the state funds are the blue. It's pretty clear that the general fund is the largest state fund, totaling over 200 billion in the 25-26 fiscal year. And then a little bit more on the general fund is that it holds state revenues that are not designated for a specific purpose and can be allocated by the legislature for any purpose that is allowed by the law. So whenever we we talk about deficit or a surplus, we are talking about this fund, the general fund. The next largest source of state funding, stay on that one, Laura, comes from special funds. And those special funds, you can see that right next to it in blue again, the lighter blue. And those special funds account for revenues that are actually designated for a specific purpose, as opposed to the general fund. And then lastly, again, the green is the federal funding, which makes up about in 25-26, about $175 billion that came from the federal government. So now let's look at how actually dollars are allocated to services. So this chart looks at state spending, which supports a wide range of public services and also systems. So this shows you that combined general and special fund spending, again, for the fiscal year 25-26, and divided into these major categories. So the key takeaway from this one is that these states' dollars support three broad categories. The first one is health and human services, which receive about 40% of state dollars. Then we have TK-12 education, which accounts for about a quarter. And then we have higher education, which is about 7%. So you can see there those major areas that the state funds cover. And then next, federal dollars. This is always an interesting chart to show because it shows you that the vast majority of federal dollars that flow through our state budget support state health and human services programs, and they total about $136 billion in the fiscal year 25-26. All right, so those are some key facts. I'm going to jump over to a little bit more about the key players in the state budget process. On the next slide, we have this list. First, we have the governor, currently Governor Newsom. Took office back in 2019 and is now in his second and final term. So this is his final budget that he signed, 26-27. Then we have the two leaders of the legislature. We have Monique Limon, who is the president pro tem since November 2025. And on the bottom, then we have Robert Rivas, who's been serving as a speaker of the state assembly since 2023. Collectively, these three folks are known as the Big Three because of the key role that they play every year in budget negotiations. And then lastly, on the right, we have the public, who also have their say through the budget process. And a little bit more on the governor. As you know, the governor has the lead role in crafting the state budget. We have sort of an executive-centered budget process that gives a lot of authority and power to the governor. And then the governor has essentially three opportunities to shape the budget. So on the next slide, we see those opportunities. First, we have the governor's proposed budget that is released each January, that essentially gives the governor first word on those budget deliberations. Then we have the May revision, which is a second opportunity for the governor to revise that proposal. And then finally, the governor plays another key role in those final negotiations with the legislative leaders in May and through June, and he tends to get the last word in these discussions. Next, we have the legislature, again, also playing a key role in the process by reviewing, rewriting, and adding to the governor's proposals with the help from the Legislative Analyst Office, commonly known as the LAO, which is a team that provides nonpartisan fiscal and policy advice to the legislature. And a lot of the work in the legislature happens in committees, both the Senate Budget Fiscal Review in the Senate, and then the Budget Committee in the Assembly. And then there's also a list of budget subcommittees that are organized based on issue areas. And a lot of the conversations happen there. For example, on childcare, that's within the Health and Human Services Committee. So discussions about the specifics of the budget proposals each year are discussed in that particular committee. And then lastly, coming back to the public, again, the public has their role in the budget process. They can engage with policymakers to inform and or influence the budget choices. One of the most important things to remember is that the public has access to that process, but it is really important to build relationships with policymakers and also their staff. That's kind of like the foundation for advocacy. And then on the next slide, once you have that foundation, there's a list of tactics that advocates can use to ensure their voices are heard. I'm not going to go through every single one, just going to kind of give you that list of different things that the public can do, such as writing letters. So quick recap before I dive into some high-level takeaways from the budget. Again, most state revenues comes from three big areas, so income taxes, sales taxes, corporation taxes. The governor plays a key role in crafting the budget, and the big three, including the legislature, settle the final deals. And then lastly, the legislature shapes the budget through committees and subcommittees, and the publics can leverage their voice by building relationships with policymakers. All right, so that's the first part. Well, I'm going to jump over now to just a quick budget overview, really big picture, top lines. So I'm going to start with some good news. Probably have been hearing this for the past few months, that compared to January, and you can go to the next slide, Laura. Compared to January, the next one, revenues have been coming in higher than projected at the beginning of the year. And the final budget also includes new and ongoing revenues. The final budget also does more than the May revision to address harms by rejecting some cuts and delaying others. It also protects some programs that a lot of low-income Californians depend on, including, for example, not cutting child care slots and continuing expansion, and then rejecting cuts to programs such as in-home supporting services. So it's generally good news in terms of balanced budget, higher revenues, protecting Californians. But there are ongoing concerns with that budget. As you know, there are those federal cuts. HR 1 really poses real and significant threats to California communities. And while the final budget does try to address some of those, it only delays many until next year, July of 2027, which leaves a lot of uncertainty ahead for next year and beyond. And then on the revenue, there are, again, those new measures that I'm going to dive into a little in the next slide. Those are a step forward, but then we think that there's room for more ambitious improvement in that area. The structural deficit is reduced, the budget is balanced over 2 years, but again, that ongoing deficit is not fully eliminated. So on the next slide, just a little bit more on the revenues. So again, since January, the revenue picture has improved substantially. The final budget does reflects those revenues coming in higher than the start of the year, which improves the state's fiscal condition. So in that final budget, it somewhat reflects the revenue estimates as of the May revision, which were almost 17 billion higher compared to the previous forecast in January. So a chunk of those revenues weren't actually available for new discretionary spending because of constitutional requirements, primarily Proposition 98 and Proposition 2, which direct portions or big portions to TK 14 education, the rainy day fund, and debt payments before any other decisions are made. So that was the first part on those revenues. Second part is that a large portion is being set aside as a cushion for 27-28, so next fiscal year. The budget in the final deal sets aside 6.4 billion for that purpose, which signals that the governor and the legislature are anticipating, a tougher fiscal environment ahead. That is actually less than what the governor originally wanted. He wanted about 9.7 to be set aside for that purpose. But then the final budget is only 6.4, which essentially allowed the legislature to reverse some of the cuts that were previously proposed. So that's the revenue picture. On the tax policy changes, The final budget does include two new ongoing revenue tax changes. Remember that chart that I showed you at the beginning? So the first one is it updates California sales tax to reflect how software is actually sold today. Right now, when you buy software, like physical software, you pay a tax, but that same software, when it's downloaded through the cloud or accessed through the cloud, is untaxed. So starting January 1st of 2027, pre-written software purchased digitally would be subject to the same sales tax as the physical version. So that's first one. The second one addresses a loophole that allows some large corporations to use accumulated tax credits to reduce their tax bill to nearly nothing in a given year. So those two combined provide meaningful ongoing revenue, which is about 1.5 billion in the first year, which is 26-27, and then growing substantially as the one of them phases in fully, which would provide about 5 billion in ongoing revenue in future years. So those are two changes. However, they don't fully address the underlying problem. You can go to the next slide, Laura. Because the state's challenges are rooted in a revenue system that has long failed to keep pace with the state's needs. And the current moment demands more than those incremental changes. So when you look at spending growth over the past several years, most of it has been simply keeping up with the rising costs. So not new programs or expanded programs. It's mainly maintaining what already existed. So that context matters as we think about what kinds of budget solutions are actually adequate, because cuts alone don't really solve that bigger structural problem. And we as an organization have been pointing to the fact that corporate tax expenditures continue to represent a significant and often overlooked part of the budget picture. Right now, tax breaks for corporations go largely unexamined on a year to year, even as programs that are serving low-income Californians face cuts or delays. We think that should change. These are effectively spending decisions, and they should be evaluated with the same scrutiny that we do for anything else that we see in the budget. So with that context, I'm going to pass it on to Laura to go over childcare.
Thank you, Eric. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here with you again. My name is Laura, as mentioned, Research Director at the Budget Center. So now I'm going to just focus the lens a bit more on childcare in the state budget. And specifically, before getting into the key proposals or the key items, we're no longer at the proposal phase, I want to provide just a bit of context on childcare in general in the state budget to help make meaning of what we're seeing in the 2026-27 final budget. So first, I want to take a step back and just remind us of why the state pays for subsidized childcare and the goals that this funding is trying to accomplish. So if we think about how much it costs to provide childcare, right? It includes the pay for childcare providers, it includes the transportation, the food, etc. That amount, or what we call the cost of care, that price tag is higher than what many families can afford. So in other words, childcare is what we call a broken market, in which the amount that families can afford to pay for childcare is not the amount, it's much lower than the amount of the actual cost of care. So as a result, we need public dollars to help fill that gap. So what you're seeing in this chart is that without access to a state subsidy, a single mom in California with an infant and a toddler will spend up to 63% of her income on childcare alone. And we know that childcare is vital for healthy child development, parents' ability to go to work and to school. And we need the state to fill this gap between what families can afford and the provider's actual cost of care. So this money that's coming through the state budget and into childcare is supposed to help ensure that both parents can afford childcare and providers are paid their cost of care. But unfortunately, we know, generally speaking, that our system is falling short, particularly with regards to how much money we're getting in the state budget for childcare. So let's take a closer look at exactly how much the state has funded childcare in the state budget over time. So what you see in this chart is funding for childcare from 2009-10 up to 2025-26. And there's a few trends that I want to point out. First, you see this initial dip happening after 2009, which is bottoming out in 2012, which represents the Great Recession. And during this time, the budget eliminated about 110,000 childcare spaces, effectively cutting funding for childcare by about 30%. And since that dip, the ECE, the Early Childhood Education Advocates, worked hard to restore those cuts. And you can see that in the trend line going up since that dip in 2012. So overall, funding has increased since those lows in the Great Recession. So yes, it is really great to see that funding has gone up since the Great Recession. However, this chart does not necessarily prove that the administration has prioritized childcare or that our state is fully filling the need of what California requires for our childcare programs. So for example, another way to look at this budget data is in this chart. So as shown here, basically you see funding for childcare as a percentage in the state budget. So the amount in the overall state budget, what percent is going to childcare? And what you see is that this amount has largely hovered around 2% over the past 5 years. So we haven't seen the substantive investments in our system to the point where we're actually moving the needle in the percent of money going toward childcare in the state budget. And we know that this has ramifications for our families in California. California is still in a place where the demand for subsidized childcare far outweighs the supply. So what you see in this chart is in 2024, our Budget Center calculations show that only 16% of children in California eligible for subsidized childcare were actually enrolled. So in summary, we know that we need more public dollars in our state budget to support childcare because we know, again, childcare is a broken market in which families cannot afford to pay the cost of what it actually takes to provide care. And while we have seen funding for childcare increase in recent years, it still just remains around 2% of the state budget, which then creates this huge gap in the unmet need for childcare across California. So with that background, let's get into some more specifics around what we're seeing in our final 2026-27 budget and talk about to what extent this budget helps to address the gaps that I explained in my previous slides. So let's first talk about spaces. So subsidized spaces in California, what was cut, what was not cut, what was expanded. So overall, what we're seeing is that childcare spaces are not cut in the final budget. So looking back at the May revision, as Eric explained, that second bite at the apple from the governor for proposing a state budget. So the May revision really compounded childcare affordability challenges by cutting funding for approximately 6,800 subsidized childcare spaces. So these cuts to childcare spaces were proposed because there is some reduction in childcare funding coming from the federal government and some other sources of funding for childcare. And about 85% of the proposed cut spaces were for our childcare vouchers, otherwise known as our alternative payment program. And while these cuts were not intended to impact any currently enrolled families, we know that these spaces are desperately needed to address the tremendously long waiting list that impact thousands of California's families. But fortunately, thanks to the tremendous advocacy from groups like Community Voices and champions in our legislature, these proposed cuts that we saw in the May revise were reversed in the final budget agreement. So again, there are no cuts to childcare spaces in the final budget, which is great. But what about expanding spaces? So as a reminder, back in 2021, the governor committed to expanding childcare spaces by approximately 206,800. This expansion was paused at roughly 130,000, 129,800 spaces. And when this was paused, there was language put into law that said that in the 2026-27 budget, the state would fund an additional 44,000 spaces to help make progress toward this overall promise of 206,800. So in the May revise that came out in May, we did not see these new spaces funded. But again, thanks to the strong advocacy from groups like Community Voices and our legislative champions, the final budget does in fact include about half of the promised spaces. So specifically, a total of 22,770 new spaces are added in our final budget. And specifically, that amounts to about 20,700 for our voucher spaces and about 2,070 for our direct contract spaces. So again, thinking back to that 16% unmet needs statistic, this will certainly help us make progress toward filling that gap. And I want to mention exactly how the state came to pay for these additional new spaces. It's interesting context. And to understand where the money came from for these additional 22,770 spaces, I'm going to provide a little bit of background on a program called the California State Preschool Program, or CSPP. The CSPP program is administered by the California Department of Education, and historically it has served 3- and 4-year-olds in both school-based settings, so at schools, or in community-based settings. And what you see here on this slide is that enrollment in our CSPP programs from 2019-20 to 2024-25 has largely dipped. So the trend line shows an initial drop of enrollment of more than 40% during the pandemic. And as you can see, there has been some increase since that initial drop, but it hasn't reached those pre-pandemic levels, in part because we know that Universal Transitional Kindergarten, or Universal TK, has officially rolled out, which has enrolled many of the 4-year-olds that would normally go to our CSPP programs. So 2 things to know. First, CSPP in recent years has been under-enrolled, meaning that money is unused every year for this program. And second, the state preschool program, or CSPP, temporarily serves 2-year-olds through 2026-27. So now that we have that clarified, the second part of this story is how CSPP is actually funded in the state budget. So the programs that operate on school sites are funded through the state's minimum funding guarantee for TK through 14 schools called Proposition 98. So this is a bucket of money just for our public schools. So the CSPP programs that are on school sites traditionally have been funded through this bucket of money. And the CSPP programs that operate in the community have traditionally been funded from our general fund, which is the same pot of money that funds all of the other programs. So in order to fund the additional 22,770 spaces, the final budget does 2 things. First, it right-sizes our CSPP program, so effectively reducing funding by about $200 million for this program, given what I mentioned previously on the under-enrollment. And it moves all the money into the Proposition 98 guarantee. So the programs that are in the community will now be funded through this pot of money that funds public schools. So given what I shared in the previous slide about under-enrollment in CSPP, This was the state's solution to help pay for these additional spaces. So that's just some additional context I wanted to provide. So in summary, the expansion of new spaces was made possible by right-sizing and shifting community-based state preschool, or CSPP, into the Proposition 98 funding stream. And additionally, I want to note that the state is trying to expand enrollment in CSPP and has made a few changes in this year's budget to do so. So essentially, if these programs are under-enrolled, given the established eligibility criteria for state preschool, programs can now enroll children of school staff, regardless of income. And the geographic boundaries now include the entire school district, not just the public school district, and also includes people working in the district, not just living there. So this is intended to help broaden the pool of people eligible to help fill these spaces in our state preschool program. So overall, when it comes to subsidized spaces in the state budget, there are no cuts to childcare spaces, and we're seeing about half of the promised 44,000 new spaces included, which was made possible through right-sizing our CSPP program and moving all that funding into Proposition 98. So that's an overview of spaces. So now let's move on to proposals that are impacting our childcare providers. And I want to start with some highlights, so some good news. So there is some modest funding in the state budget, about $11.8 million, to support infrastructure for providers impacted by the 2025 wildfires. There's also about $28 million one-time federal funding to support provider relief efforts from disasters occurring in 2023 and 24. Los Angeles would be included in there, as a disaster may include a fire, a flood, an earthquake, or period of civil unrest. So there are additional dollars in our final state budget for these infrastructure supports for providers, which is great to see. Now let's shift to some less good news. So first, talking about provider pay. In order to understand what's happening with provider pay in the state budget, I just want to remind you all of how providers are actually paid currently. So there's this survey that goes out across the state called the Regional Market Rate Survey. And it's issued every couple of years, and it asks childcare providers how much they charge parents for childcare. So the current childcare provider pay is based off of the 2018 survey. So yes, 8 years ago, very outdated, and at the 75th percentile, meaning about a quarter of providers charge more than what the rate is currently. So again, this is data collected in 2018, and it's based off of what providers can, or what parents can afford, but we know that the cost of providing care is higher. So this is extremely low, right? So this is unacceptably low. So our home-based childcare provider union, called Childcare Providers United, negotiated an additional payment called these cost of care plus payments that are added on top of this 2018 payment to help providers make ends meet. But overall, we know that this amount is far from what providers need. Specifically, using the state's estimates, for example, a small family childcare provider serving an infant is only being paid about 28% of the cost of care, even with these cost of care plus stipends. That is not enough. And unfortunately, going back to the budget, our final budget does not make clear when provider pay will improve. And we don't have any additional supports for our California Department of Social Services to help implement and move toward this new rate structure. So given that there's some misalignment between the state and what the field is saying around the cost of care, it is unclear when the state is actually going to implement these new rates, which we know are desperately needed for our childcare providers. So in addition to not advancing fair pay for providers, the final budget also really exacerbates the low pay that providers currently receive via two distinct setbacks. So the first is this cost of living adjustment. So starting this year, all childcare providers should receive a cost of living adjustment. Back in January, this cost of living adjustment was 2.41%. And I want to remind you, some providers are only being paid 28% of the cost of care. So 2.41 really isn't enough to begin with. But on top of that, come May revise, that was cut all the way down to 2.01%. And unfortunately, in the final budget, the cost of living adjustment for our childcare providers still remains at 2.01%. And notably, I want to include that a 4.31% super COLA is included in the final budget for our TK through 12 schools, even though childcare programs and TK classrooms, we're all educating 4-year-olds, we're all educating children 0 to 12 for many of our providers, but we see this decrease for our childcare providers in the cost of living adjustment, whereas our TK through 12 schools did see this super COLA. Secondly, and lastly, the state is walking back implementing what's called prospective pay. Prospective pay refers to paying childcare providers in advance or at delivery of childcare services. And doing so really supports childcare providers' financial solvency. Given that they're paid so little, their margins are very thin, prospective pay would have really helped them with their financial solvency. Now, shortly before the May revise was released, the federal administration, the Trump administration, reversed its requirement for states to have to pay providers prospectively. So California can still do this, but they decided not to. They decided to stop progress on paying childcare providers prospectively. And unfortunately, in the final budget, we are still seeing the state not moving forward with implementing prospective pay in the 2026-27 fiscal year. So overall, while we do see some bright spots in the budget with expanding subsidized childcare spaces and those infrastructure supports, without supporting our childcare providers through increasing their pay and supporting financial solvency, California families will still continue to face challenges with accessing care as providers continue to leave the field. So that's what's happening with childcare in the final budget. And I want to close by just talking about what's next. So you might be wondering, well, the final budget's signed. What do you mean, what's next? Well, somebody at some point is always working on the state budget. The state budget is really a year-round process. So while the final budget package is signed, there is still some clear next steps that advocates can take. So in particular, in the next few months, so July to December, it really is the quietest period of the budget process, and a lot of actions happen behind the scenes. But again, there are still plenty of opportunities for advocates to have their voices heard and say, hey, we don't like what we saw in this final state budget. Let's make it better in the 2027-28 state budget. So specifically, this is a really good time to be scheduling those introductory meetings with staffers in the legislature and executive branch, so people in the administration and the legislature who can be helpful to know for your advocacy for childcare. Sacramento runs on relationships. This quieter period is a great time to not only just figure out, okay, who is my senator, who is my assembly member, but also get to know them and be able to voice your priorities when it comes to childcare and other items in the state budget that you might be interested in advocating for. And I also want to note that we are in an election year. As Eric mentioned, Governor Gavin Newsom is finishing up his term. We will be having a new governor in the coming year. So now is also a really good time to get to know those candidates, understand their priorities when it comes to childcare. So once they enter into the administration, you all can hit the ground running with knowing how to think about your talking points and what to speak toward so that we can get childcare prioritized in the state budget. And lastly, I want to note that there sometimes is some budget cleanup, as we call it, that happens in August. So sometimes the state gets additional information about how much money we have. And there can be some shifts that happen in August for the state budget. So it's important to keep in mind if there are shifts in August for childcare to help inform any priorities or talking points when you build those relationships in the fall. So that's all from us. That was a lot of information. Thank you for bearing with us. I do want to note that the Budget Center does have a resource called a Budget Academy, which will provide you with videos, guidance, tutorials, all things Budget 101 for you to catch up to speed and become state budget experts so that you all are ready to hit the ground running with your advocacy for our 2027-28 budget cycle. And you can always reach out to Eric and I. Here's my email if you have any questions about what's happening in the state budget. Happy to answer any questions at this time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Laura and Eric. I see a few in the Q&A, and I also see a few in the chat. I see some got answered. I'll read. How does this funding by Cassandra Hudson Johnson, how does this funding affect private nonprofit preschools and schools?
That's a great question. So in terms of private nonprofit preschools, I think it depends on whether or not direct impacts depend whether or not the private nonprofit preschool has spaces or accepts children with a subsidy. And so if you all have, and it probably impacts whether or not maybe you're thinking around whether or not you want to have children with a subsidy given the rates. Or copays that you might want to add on top of your rates would be one way. And then I want to turn to Eric in terms of any implications you want to share for our school system.
Sorry, as it relates to
generally what we're seeing in the state budget in terms of the additional spaces that we're seeing. So the 22,770 spaces will directly impact providers who there will be more opportunity for providers perhaps to have spaces for our subsidy children. And then the rate situation, given that we're not seeing advancements in provider pay, will certainly impact providers who accept children with a subsidy in terms of their payments. And then I'm curious, Eric, if you think that there are any key implications in the budget for schools that might be helpful to share.
Yeah, I think the whole shift of CSPP, I think that may have an impact in terms of enrollment, the kinds of, and there's a mix of other resources that we didn't talk about that go to supporting school districts for the past few years. Not only has the state have been trying to increase enrollment in TK, but also CSPP, as Laura mentioned. And we've seen increases in enrollment, primarily if you compare that to pre-COVID years. We've seen improvement, not to the level that it was, so there's still kind of a gap that the state needs to fill in terms of CSPP. And then TK, you've been seeing that the state has basically planned for greater uptake in that program. So this could mean that that shift that a lot of advocates have been talking about in terms of kids moving from one program to another, kids participating in multiple programs, we'll just continue to see a revamp of that. And this is going to be the second year of full universal implementation of TK. So probably see the combined effects of all these different policies that have changed. And now we have a list of new changes in the CSPP program. So we're likely to see that shift that we've been seeing. But it's hard to, I think at this point is hard to kind of draw any conclusions around like what what those changes mean for schools, but I do anticipate that enrollment in those programs is likely to continue to go up. Hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Eric. We have lots of other questions, which I'm so happy about. Love these questions. I'll read some that I hope can maybe speak for more than just one person, more general. I see one that says, will there be a 2.01% COLA adjustment applied to the cost of care plus payment by
Yes.
Pedro?
Yes.
Yes.
So the cost of living adjustment, that 2.01%, if you think back to my slide showing there's the regional market rate, base rate based off of those 2018, the 2018 survey, that is not going to receive that 2.01% cost of living adjustment. It's those cost of care plus payments that receive that 2.01%, which is the smaller of the two, unfortunately.
Thanks, Laura. What can we do as a whole to increase our income?
Our being provider or our who's
As a provider, yes.
as a provider? Well, I would say that your advocacy is desperately needed. The
Mm.
legislator needs to hear from you. They need to hear stories about thinking about your day to day and what it actually means to not be paid the cost of care. Thinking about the expenses that you have matched against the payment you receive and how that impacts you. So there are definite ways to find advocacy opportunities so that you can join groups to make sure you have opportunities to tell your story either at next year's budget cycle or, as I mentioned, in the coming fall, getting to build those relationships with your legislators so that they can hear from you with regards to what it means for you to not be paid the cost of care, to hopefully get them to move quicker so that you all can get paid an increased payment. Anything you'd add, Eric or Sonia and Justin? Any tips on different groups that providers might want to coordinate with so that they can get their stories heard?
Yes, I think Community Voices is a great one. It's a great one. We have a workshop specifically for how to tell your story. Really helps connect with other providers and families, and just a lot of resources that we have here. So that's one that I know. I don't know if Justin, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, as a resource and referral agency, Crystal Stairs and many of our partner orgs across LA County, if you're not specifically in our service area, although you can still come and join us, we offer opportunities for, business development trainings, looking for opportunities for you as a childcare provider to look for ways to unlock new income. We have a couple of special programs for childcare providers that, do more of strategy around how to increase your, business visibility, that business acumen side of development and stuff. So between the advocacy, which, I'm always very leaning into to look at how income is increased, to also the side of how you're developing as a small business owner. You could come to Crystal Stairs through Community Voices or any of our other doors you can enter into, and we can figure out ways to best support you in those opportunities. So yeah. I see, Sonia, we have a couple of questions that I would say, can speak to generally everybody. And I'm just looking at time, so I was just going to jump in to just ask those and then give you the time to close out, just because I want to make sure we have enough time to hear these questions, but also make sure that we're respectful of everyone's time and end on time. And one of those questions that I see right here is, uh, how about the license exempt providers? Can you explain both with pay rates?
Yeah, so our license exempt providers, um, essentially that same methodology of how you're of using this regional market rate 2018 survey plus the cost of care, that applies to our unlicensed family, friend, and neighbor providers. And that 2.01% cost of living adjustment will also show up in your cost of care plus amounts for our family, friend, and neighbor unlicensed providers. And I would say, in terms of advocacy, FFN providers are so needed in terms of visiting with legislators, visiting with administration staff to really underscore the value and importance of our unlicensed family, friend, and neighbor providers. Justin heard me speak about a month ago about in LA County, just this past year in 2025, between family, friend, and neighbor, licensed family childcare, and licensed centers, parents, the majority of parents are enrolling in family, friend, and neighbor. And we know that that's a choice that parents are making because they see the value in our unlicensed providers, which needs to be further expressed and communicated to our policymakers.
Can I add something to that? And I think I saw a question about potentially continuing to lose kids to the school system. I think one reminder is that schools only cover part of the day, part of the week, does not include summers. So I think that's also something important that the policymakers and school districts are also trying to understand and try to solve, because they also see it as a challenge. In the budget, we see some money that school districts are getting to be able to provide a kind of like a package of programs to families. And they've been doing this attempt since TK expansion started, because TK is a short day, so families don't work 4 or 5 hours. They work more than that. They also work weekends. So I think also emphasizing sort of what the non-LEA or non-school-based programs also provide, that is really important when you think about like how families conduct their day, the types of jobs that families have. So I think that's an important, not only to present that, but also think about ways in which that connects to these other programs.
So much, Eric and Laura. We really appreciate it. It is now 1, and so, like Justin said, to be respectful of everyone's time, thank you so much for showing out. And really, like with all these questions, the information was amazing. So thank you so much. We appreciate it. And I'm going to share my last slide with you all. As you heard Dr. Pryor say, it's really important that we are advocating, and an excellent opportunity is joining in Community Voices. You can receive updates and opportunities to always empower yourself, learn more, and go and advocate in front of policymakers. And thank you so much for joining us today. We will be sending out an email with the workshop, with the webinar recording, and answer any questions you may have. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.